Welcome to Drugs and Stuff, a podcast from the Drug Policy Alliance.
Welcome into Drugs and Stuff. This is a place where smart people talk about drugs. My name is Tommy McDonald. I'm your host. I'm not the smart person of this show. I'm thrilled to bring in an actual smart person. I want to welcome Representative Ro Khanna, who has welcomed us into his office in the California's 17th Congressional District. For the listeners out there, let me tell you a little bit about, Congressman Khanna. As I said, he represents California's 17th Congressional District, which is located in the heart of the Silicon Valley and serving in his first term. The rookie congressman sits on the House Budget and Armed Services Committee and is the vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Now, prior to serving in Congress, Representative Khanna taught economics at Stanford University, law at Santa Clara University, and American Jurisprudence at San Francisco State University. He wrote the book, Entrepreneurial Nation, Why Manufacturing is Still the Key to America's Future, and worked as a lawyer specializing in intellectual property law. Representative Khanna served in President Barack Obama's administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And in 2012, California Governor Jerry Brown appointed him to the California Workforce Investment Board. He's also provided pro bono legal counsel to Hurricane Katrina victims with the Mississippi Center for Justice and co-authored an amicus brief in a fair housing U.S. Supreme Court case. Originally a Philadelphia native, I didn't know that. Once again, Representative Khanna, thank you so much for inviting us in and talking with us about drug policy. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for your visionary work on this issue.
Thank you very, very much. And I must say I have to apologize for a little bit of the gettiness. We're a new podcast, and you are quite the get for us.
Oh, so please.
We're very excited to be talking with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Let us get to know you a little bit. Tell us about your background.
Yeah.
What made you decide to run for Congress? And now that you've done such an extraordinary job, what are your priorities for your term?
So I'm the son of immigrants, was born in Philadelphia. My parents came here in the 1960s. My father went to Michigan, and then they settled, my mom and he settled down in Philadelphia. My interest in politics came from my grandfather. He had spent 4 years in jail during Gandhi's independence movement in the 1940s with Gandhi, and spent 15 years fighting for human rights and India's independence. And that really inspired me to care about human rights, about justice, to understand the role politics can have on people. And of course, it was the Gandhi and the independence movement that in part had an influence on Dr. King. And Dr. King had spent time in India, and it was the civil rights movement that Dr. King led to the 1965 Immigration Reform Act that allowed my parents to come to this country, because before 1965 and the civil rights movement, we really didn't open up our shores to people from Asia. And Dr. King, of course, said he could take all of Gandhi's ideas, but not the vegetarianism, because he couldn't take the fried chicken out of his churches. So it's a great a tradition when I look back at my the heritage and what inspired me. And I had the luck of working on President Barack Obama's very first campaign when he was running for the state Senate. I was a student at University of Chicago, and he was in his 30s, and that really gave me an exposure to electoral politics.
Okay. You're certainly coming into Congress at an extraordinary period in our history with the election of Donald Trump and his antics. Talk about the climate in Washington these days as you all try to make significant change in what seems to be, a very kind way to put this. What's the nice word for chaotic administration?
Well, it's chaotic, and on quite a few issues, it's moving us backwards. And it's, as we were talking before the podcast, it's this odd time, because on the one hand, I feel such energy among young people who want to tackle climate change, who want to have a more just foreign policy, who are sick of all the foreign wars and want us to live up to our ideals. We're talking, and we'll get into it, about of dramatic changes in our drug policy and legalization of cannabis and other drugs. We're talking about increasing minimum wage to $15 a living wage, and taking on the pharmaceutical companies. So you have all this progressive energy. On the other hand, you have a president who is denying the man-made role in climate change, who is moving the clock back on environmental regulations, who's engaged in increasing troops into Afghanistan when we know it hasn't worked in 16 years. So there is this tension between, I think, the people in this country, the grassroots that really is fighting for a more just society, perhaps more progressive in vision than ever before, and the person we have in office. But what gives me hope is there are a lot of people pushing in a more progressive direction.
Mm-hmm. We over at the Drug Policy Alliance and the listeners of Drugs and Stuff are obviously very interested in drug policy in this country, particularly highlighting the failure of the war on drugs. And in the last 40 years, the federal and state government has spent over $1 trillion fueling the drug war. Now, as a former economics professor, talk to us a little bit about your view and how this has been an extraordinary misuse of taxpayer dollars. And where would you like to see this money go forward in the future if we were able to at least, dial back the drug war a little bit?
Well, it's been, of course, a waste of our resources that we could have been spending on preschool education or making college tuition free or on education. But the biggest problem of the drug war is at a young age of 15, 18, 20, 25, we're putting a scarlet letter on young folks who may have used drugs or used it recreationally. I worked for a judge after law school and as a law clerk, and he had this interesting insight. He said, Ro, it's very difficult if you ever get on the other side of the law. The process is pretty unforgiving for any individual. And what we have done is take people at such a young age. And it's not just that they're spending time in jail. It's the fact that they're developing a record of having a criminal background. And we are scarring their future for life. And so what we're doing is having them disengage from society. I couldn't think of a more counterproductive policy in terms of giving people hope and aspiration in having a future. And so we have to just radically think this. My view is there's a young person running for governor in Illinois who has talked about commuting the sentences of low offenses when it comes to drug crimes and giving people a clean slate. That is something long overdue. We ought to be certainly decriminalizing this, and in certain cases, as Senator Booker is doing, legalizing the use on marijuana and encouraging states to legalize it.
And tell us a little bit about H.R. 1227, a bill that you're co-sponsoring. It's a bipartisan bill that would decriminalize marijuana. Can you tell us a little bit about your decision to co-sponsor that and what your hope is for that piece of legislation?
Well, for my view, it's a very simple idea that we should not have people have criminal records because of their use of marijuana. Now, no one is saying that this means people should go use marijuana, just like no one is saying that people should go and drink a lot or smoke a lot. But this is a question of public policy. If I don't exercise, does that mean that I deserve a criminal record? If I go eat too much cholesterol, does that mean I should have a criminal record? If I smoke, does that mean I should have a criminal record? But what has happened, and we know this, that the brunt of the war on drugs has been borne by people of color, and that they have, those opportunities have been their opportunities and horizons have been denied. So what this bill would do is make sure that people are not going to develop a criminal record because of their use of marijuana.
And for people who want to follow the process of this legislation, tell us where we are in the process right now and what we can look forward to for people who want to support this.
Well, I think when I joined, there were maybe only 10, 12 co-sponsors, but the momentum is building, and we're getting more co-sponsors every day. I think the fact that Senator Booker is now introducing a similar piece of legislation in the Senate is a great step. My hope is that not just him, but all of our candidates are going to run for president, whether it's Warren or Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders, that they all will get behind this as part of the Democratic Party platform, that we have got to stop the war on drugs. And every Democrat in the House caucus should make this a key part. We know the statistics. We know that this is not what is leading to crime. If anything, what is happening is we're getting folks, giving them this arrest record early and telling them basically, you're not part of the system. You're an outsider. You're on the other side. And when you take away that hope, when you brand someone as an outsider, it's more likely to inspire them to do things that are unlawful, because they say, well, what do we have to lose? You've already told us we don't belong in your society. So I am hopeful that we have learned our lesson and that we're going to have more enlightened policy.
Now, for those who have been following marijuana reform, this recent flurry of activity has to be promising because, the federal supremacy clause has always trumped whatever the states are doing. But as you have seen across the country, and once again, California leading the way, states are starting to tackle this issue, particularly of marijuana, either through legalization, through decriminalization, or through medical marijuana.
Right.
But talk a little bit about, the states leading the way, and particularly California, which responded with Proposition 64, which legalized use for adults.
Well, it passed overwhelmingly in my district. In fact, yesterday I was at a city council meeting in Santa Clara, and the city council was debating how they would implement Prop 64 and where marijuana stores could be placed from a zoning perspective and what regulations would be on their sale. And several city council members said, look, the voters spoke. 60% in Santa Clara County voted for this. So I think it's terrific that states are taking the lead. States are often the laboratories of policy that then go up to the federal government. And now we have a federal policy that says that should be legal, that not just under federal law, but that it also incentivizes states to legalize it under state law. And anyone who looks at this from a rational basis will realize that it's not worth the overcrowding of our jails. It's not worth depriving people of education opportunity, and it's not condoning, but it's not condoning the use. I mean, it's not telling people, okay, go smoke marijuana. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that. This has nothing to do with is it healthy or not. It has to do with what is federal policy.
Okay, and let's sort of talk about the economic value to states choosing to legalize marijuana. You had a great statement on Twitter, and if you're not following Representative Khanna on Twitter, I suggest that you do. He's a great follow and a great read. You want to give the folks your Twitter handle real quick before we jump into this question?
Sure, it's at Ro Khanna or Rep Ro Khanna, but that would be great.
Now, back on June 19th of this year, you tweeted, legalizing marijuana is a no-brainer. Just look at Colorado. The economic value is astronomical. Do you think that the stance that the U.S. government has taken around prohibition has wound up costing millions and millions of dollars in lost revenue? Are we missing a great revenue stream by choosing to ignore, regulating and taxing the sale and consumption of marijuana?
We are, because what's happening is that this economy exists, but it's in the black market. It's not that we have stopped the sale, that these sales aren't going on. It's just that it's unregulated, and we're missing the tax revenue. So we don't know whether it's safe. We don't have a way of regulating it like we do other products, and we're also missing the tax benefits. And that's why bringing it into the system where we can regulate it, like we regulate drugs, like we regulate alcohol, like we regulate cigarettes, not only provides an economic benefit, it also provides a safety and a health benefit.
So, Congressman, I want to turn to something that has garnered tons of attention in the press and from policymakers, and it's the discussion around opiates in this country. Recently, the president declared an emergency around opioids and the use of opioids. But it seems like the approach is more of the same old. Criminalization, prohibition, crackdowns, locking more and more people up, and less on treatment, less on preventing overdoses. Those of us in the drug policy reform movement are viewing this not so much as an opioid crisis, but an overdose crisis. And with International Overdose Awareness Day on August 31st, talk to us a little bit about, your thoughts on what's going on around responding to, problems that people are having with opioids, and particularly the overdoses that seem to be overtaking the country, especially ones that seem to be entirely preventable.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have to look at what is causing it. And it's not that people have criminal intent. It's that they are often, it's a cry for help. They need a fulfilling place with their family, with their place of worship, in a community, having a job and friends. And what we have to do is say, what can we as a society, as a nation do to provide them with an ability to overcome either addiction or overdose, and to find peace and happiness and fulfillment in their lives, which often is missing because of the extraordinary hardships that they're facing, either in their family life or in their communities, or because of their economic situation. And the rhetoric of criminalization is not going to do anything. What will do things is providing people with hope and opportunity and community.
I want to read something that you wrote on Facebook on June 29th. This was around the time when the Affordable Health Care Act debate was going on in Congress, when millions were faced with losing coverage, which included access to treatment. You said that solving the opioid epidemic requires understanding the connection between addiction and related health conditions like chronic pain, anxiety, and depression, conditions which require comprehensive insurance in order to receive proper treatment. Now, in that comment, and you go on to say more, I'm hearing something that is getting lost in this debate. People who are actually suffering, people who really do suffer from chronic pain, people who aren't getting the proper treatment that they need, whether it's substance abuse treatment or mental health treatment. Talk about how destructive it could be to take the focus away from the individual and healing folks and making them whole, and putting the focus on throwing people in cages and continuing the prohibitionist approach that has gotten us into this drug war boondoggle to begin with.
Yeah, well, it's as you point out, a lot of times the overdose is because people have underlying issues, and those underlying issues are often because of a lack of treatment, because they have not had access to quality care, because they haven't been able to, because there's a stigma often to seeking that care, and they have no other option in their life, and they lack often the network that some of us has. The greatest privilege I have in my life is friends and family who are there as a support structure. And a lot of people don't have that. They may have one or two people, and those people aren't there. They're all on their own. And what we have to do as a society is find a way to care for people's wellness, to give them, to treat their underlying conditions, to care about their mental well-being. In some cases, it requires medicine intervention. In some cases, help from counselors or psychologists or psychiatrists, but to care about the holistic well-being of people in our society. And that really is the long-term approach. It's not easy. It's not a good soundbite. You can't say, okay, I'm going to increase arrests and campaign on it. But I think people are waking up to substance, and they want people who are going to really talk about how we're going to move forward. And I think they're also waking up to the racial disparity of some of these laws. I mean, Chris Hayes has a brilliant book, A Colony Within a Nation. Chris Hayes, the commenter on MSNBC, where he talks about how he was in his early 20s and he didn't realize that he had a joint in one of his bags as he was going into a stadium, and he got stopped with his prospective father-in-law, and the security officer kind of joked about it and let him go through. Well, that same experience for someone African-American in Oakland getting stopped with a joint may end that person's future, may put it in arrest record, maybe interpreted not as a young person going through a rebellious years of college, but a young person who's committing a crime, and that this is something that may lead to future crimes, and let's nip it in the bud early is the often the attitude. So the way these laws have had disparate impact on people based on race and geography cannot be overstated, and it's really one of the most compelling reasons to look at fundamentally changing these laws.
Now, in the last couple of years, this country's issue with race has been laid bare, whether, the incidents of police brutality and police killings to the events in Charlottesville. I think we have sort of ripped the Band-Aid off of the underlying undercurrent of white supremacy in this country, which, we're discovering was one of the basic tenets of the drug war. The story about Richard Nixon and his aides, declaring the drug war as a system to control, as he said, the blacks. So it's rooted in itself in white supremacy. And you've said, several times issuing the racial disparities in drug law enforcement. Here's a quote you had in The Intercept not too long ago. We also have to be true to our convictions to inspire people to believe that we are fighting for justice. And that means addressing the fact that 1 of every 3 African Americans at some point will face incarceration. And how are we going to have criminal justice reform? How are we going to deal with issues of police brutality? I mean, I think you bring up like 3 stellar points in this. It's a statement about racial inequality within the criminal justice system. You're talking about criminal justice reform and police brutality. And because these have become such hot button issues, what's your advice to the average citizen who is, either been enraged about this for a long time or is just now experiencing an awakening? What can the average American citizen do to work towards a more just society and also support what you're doing on the legislative level to alleviate these injustices?
One is to help spread the facts. I mean, I know when we talk about it, it comes off a statistic, but think about it for a second. 1 in 3 African Americans at some point would be in jail. I mean, it's a staggering fact when you think about what consequence being in jail has on a person's entire future in this country, whether to be a father or a mother, whether to be a parent, whether to be a job owner. This is people say America is a forgiving country. Well, it's a forgiving country if you're born into a certain class. But it's not forgiving, a very forgiving country if you have a criminal background. It's a very, very unforgiving country once you have gotten caught up on the wrong side of the law. And I think people are just unaware of this. I don't think that the average, I didn't know all the statistics, and I am pretty engaged. So I think one of the things we can do is we all now have a microphone, whether as a podcast or on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram or on Snapchat. In some sense, we've democratized information.
Yes.
And we need to share stories. We need to share stories about personal stories so that folks start to understand the impact it's having. The second thing I would say is I have never been more hopeful about this next generation's commitment to issues of justice, to issues of human rights, to understanding that we have to seek restorative justice, that we have had historical sins that are still not answered for. And you look at people like young folks. I had a young staffer who's not African American, but loves Ta-Nehisi Coates and has read his entire work and says, these young kids have grown up reading this stuff. So that gives me a great amount of hope that this new generation gets it, and they get it at their core, that there has been a historical injustice and that there has to be restorative policies. Now, the problem is that they're not the ones right now making the decisions. They're not, unfortunately, some of them aren't voting. They got to go vote, and they're not in positions of leadership, but they will be. Mm-hmm. And so what we have to do, I think, is not lose hope, because what we see, I think, currently in the administration is the last vestiges of an old politics, but it's not the future. The future belongs to these new generation, and we need to just keep building the grassroots movement so that when we do have a progressive president, we're going to do things that haven't been done in the last 50 years and seeking change and really having some of these policies make up for some of the historical injustices.
Representative Khanna, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time, and thank you so much for speaking with our audience and sharing your views. Just a couple quick questions before we get out of here. I want to keep you on your schedule. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your thoughts on Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General. Now, back in May, he asked congressional leaders to undo federal medical marijuana protections that have been in place since 2014. And I think around that time, you tweeted out, if Jeff Sessions had his way, he would reinstate Nixon's destructive and ignorant war on drugs. Thoughts on the job Sessions is doing, the dangers that his presence in the role of Attorney General could present in taking us backwards in terms of dismantling the war on drugs?
Well, I didn't support, obviously, his ascension to the cabinet. Given his past, I thought it sent an awful message. But beyond that, once he was there, I said, okay, I opposed him, but let's keep an open mind. And then what he has done is double down on reactionary policies, obviously trying to further the criminalization of and prosecution of drug offenses, rolling back recently the issues on affirmative action. I mean, if you believe that we do have a need for restorative justice, what we ought to be doing is looking at places like historically black colleges and communities that have not had opportunity, and understand that race played a huge role and that we have a affirmative obligation to make sure those folks have a chance to succeed. And Sessions is going in the opposite direction. And so it's just this odd time, because all the young folks are reading people like Coates, and they see a person in charge of the Justice Department who's taking us in a more reactionary direction. But I am hopeful in the future, because we have so many people who now get it. And in the long run, an informed, mobilized citizenry will win.
Speaking of an informed, mobilized citizenry, for people listening to this podcast, for people who agree that the war on drugs is a failure and should be ended, what can people do to support you, the voice of the people, in your efforts to dismantle this? They often say, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. How can we, as advocates, support the work that you're doing and give you that groundswell and that support that you need to advocate a legislative agenda that's going to achieve what we want?
I appreciate it. I think folks listening should consider running for office at any level, serving on commissions, serving in their local city governments or with police task forces or mayor's task forces on these issues. They can help be active on social media. When people speak out, members of Congress, on these issues of sponsoring legislation to legalize drugs or decriminalize drugs, or talking about commuting sentences of drug offenders who are there for petty crimes, they can retweet that. They can share that. They can comment on that. You'd be surprised how politicians, how much they pay attention and how many comments they get, how many retweets they get. These things matter. A citizen has never been more empowered in our democracy, given all the tools. And when people say, Ro, but there's so much stacked against us, I think about, my grandfather's life, 15 years fighting for India's independence, 4 years in jail, where he didn't even know, where his family didn't even know would get to talk to him once every year. And you look at the sacrifices people like him made, or my colleague John Lewis or John Conyers made in the civil rights movement, and the struggles that they had were so enormous compared to the struggles we face today, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And our generation finally has a shot of racial reconciliation and restorative justice. And all that it requires is active, persistent engagement. And if we have that engagement across this country, we may see a 21st century that finally brings justice and has America live up to the ideals that people like Dr. King and all envisioned.
We've been talking with California Representative Ro Khanna, who, again, has been extraordinarily generous. I want to thank you for talking with our listeners. And on behalf of the Drug Policy Alliance and the listeners of Drugs and Stuff, it has been an honor and a treat to speak with you. Thank you so much.
It's been my honor, and thank you for the work you're doing and that your listeners are doing.
Thank you, sir.
Drugs and Stuff is brought to you by the Drug Policy Alliance. If you like what you hear on the podcast, do us a favor and rate the show on iTunes. Give it 5 stars and a nice review. Also, we love to hear from you. Tweet at us at Drugs and Stuff DPA, use the hashtag Drugs and Stuff, and check out our website drugpolicy.org to see the other work we do, sign up for our emails, and donate. Special thanks to our producer Catherine Heller and to the hardworking staff of the Drug Policy Alliance for all of their work. Thanks for listening.